All right, now we're going to get started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Tracy Glab, Executive Director of the Flint Institute of Arts Museum and Art School, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture. Tonight, we have Dr. Ashley Lemke presenting Flooded History, Underwater Archaeology in the Great Lakes. The Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture Series was established in 2012 by Dr. Alan Klein to address the topics of art, religion, and history. Thank you, Alan, for continuing to bring these wonderful lectures to the FIA. And he's here tonight, so please make a really warm... Thank you. And the next Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture will be on Wednesday, April 23rd, with Dr. Marcus Cruz presenting two talks. The first is at 2 p.m., Marco Polo's America, the Medieval Influence on Early Modern Maps of the New World. The second lecture is at 6 p.m., and it is Portraying the Fantastic, Gothic Architecture in Contemporary Cinema. So tell all your Harry Potter fans. I think that might come up. Before I introduce our guests, I would like to thank the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for their continued support, which is so deeply appreciated and vital to the FIA. I would also like to thank the citizens of Genesee County for demonstrating their support of the FIA by means of the Genesee County Arts, Education, and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which provides free entry to the FIA for Genesee County residents 7 days a week. And a big thank you to Huntington Bank for sponsoring Huntington Free Saturdays, which allows everyone beyond our county to have free entry on Saturdays. Now, please take a moment to silence your electronic devices. Make sure mine is. Okay. Dr. Ashley Lemke is an anthropological archaeologist. She is an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, former chair of the Advisory Council on Underwater Archaeology, and Explorers Club Fellow. She is a leading researcher on archaeology of hunter-gatherers and has worked extensively on both terrestrial and underwater archaeological projects from the lower Paleolithic in Europe to 19th century sites in the Arctic. Everyone, please join me in what I know is going to be a great talk and warm Flint welcome for Dr. Ashley Lemke.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. I want to thank everybody at FIA. They've already given me such an amazing time in Flint. It's fun for me to be back here. I lived in Michigan for 8 years, but now I'm on the other side of the lake, so I'm in Milwaukee. I had a quick flight. And thank you, of course, to Dr. Klein for putting these lectures on. It's so fantastic to be able to come and present today. So we are going to go on a journey back in time and underwater into our Great Lakes that we all know and love. But today we're going to think about them a little bit differently and imagine kind of what the Great Lakes would have looked like at the end of the last ice age and how archaeologists are uncovering these brand new stories of evidence that's preserved below the lakes in a way that we never have been able to do until really recently, the last several years. So this is probably what most people think of when they think of underwater archaeology, right? There's an amazing, wonderful record of shipwrecks preserved all over the world, but there are many thousands of them in the Great Lakes. And they're preserved so well because of the cold fresh water in the Great Lakes region, right? So these wrecks, this is a wooden wreck. It sank in 1854, and it's preserved almost frozen in time, right? Because of those cold waters, it's in pretty deep water as well. So sunlight isn't penetrating it too much. It's preserved from being degraded or eroding away. And archaeologists from all over the world have visited the Great Lakes to examine boats like this because it's such a great storytelling device, right? We all know these stories of these harrowing tales of ships that were caught in storms, ships that collided. Many in the Great Lakes actually caught fire and then sank. And this one, just to give you a sense of scale here, that very small silver dot on the far end is a scuba diver, about a 6'2" scuba diver. So when I see shipwrecks as an archaeologist, I see actually an easy target in some ways, right? They're big. They look like shipwrecks. We often have historical photos of them. We have a lot of text that tells us about the life of these vessels, but it's still really challenging to find them once they sank in the Great Lakes, right? And this is what we often think of, but what we're gonna talk about tonight and what's becoming more clear all over the world is it's not just shipwrecks that are underwater. Those aren't the only archaeological sites that exist. There are many different kinds of sites, not just boats that happen to sink, but sites like this. This is in Baia in Italy. And this is a Roman mosaic. So Baia was kind of a Roman party town, is how we often think about it. It was where the Roman aristocrats would go and kind of summer on the seaside. So there's immaculate palaces, there's villas with these really beautiful mosaic floors. And due to tectonic activity in the area, about 2/3 of Baia sank into the Mediterranean. So we often say this Roman party town sank, which is an interesting way to think about it. But now you can go and you can scuba dive or snorkel or take a glass bottom boat and see the parts of this Roman village that are underwater now. So it's not just shipwrecks, it's also ancient cities. And what we're going to talk about in the Great Lakes is even older than that. So beyond historical boats from the 1800s, beyond Roman villas that are sunk in the Mediterranean, we're going to think about landscapes that date to the last ice age. So this is part of a larger story of global sea level rise. And that's what you're seeing on this image here with the blue line kind of rising. That's showing you how much water rose after the glacial ice sheets started melting at the end of the last ice age. So we're talking about 20,000 years ago. The world started getting a little bit warmer. Those big glacial ice sheets are melting, and as they melt, right, that water rose all over the planet. And you can see it happened really, really, really rapidly over the course of a few thousand years. We go from the last glacial maximum, that's where the ice is at its maximum extent, to all the way up to where we are today. We're at 0 on that line of the sea level rise we know that makes the coastlines that we know that we have today. But vast landscapes were exposed during this time of lower sea level. So shallow areas all over the world on the continental shelves were exposed in dry land during that time period of that last glacial maximum. So you have water that's frozen in the ice sheets, you have water levels that are much lower, and these landscapes that are exposed. So the image that you're looking at, this map, is Beringia. Who's ever heard of the Bering Land Bridge? You think back, right? Exactly. To maybe in high school or middle school, you're learning about maybe how peoples came to the Western Hemisphere. That's the Bering Land Bridge. So everything that's shaded that light green would have been dry land. And this isn't a narrow little, 2-lane bridge. It's a continent that people were inhabiting. It's a vast, huge landscape that was available and dry, again, because the global sea level was lower. This becomes really important for archaeologists to try to understand how people first came into the Western Hemisphere, because if you have those lower water levels, then you have more land that was available for those prehistoric peoples, right? Or the ancient peoples that were first making their way to this continent. So we as archaeologists tend to look at artifacts, some of them very beautiful things, right, that the FIA has, and many others, things like stone tools that are shown here, that are really distinct for different time periods. So all these yellow dots on the map are places where stone tools like this one have been found. As far as we know right now, those are the oldest artifacts in the Western Hemisphere, and they're kind of all over the place. But if you look at this map, you see that Florida was about twice the size. And you see up by Alaska, that's part of the Bering Land Bridge, there's all these areas that people could have been living in. And until we go underwater and look, we're not sure if there's artifacts there or not, right? So the available landscape was much, much bigger. And so as archaeologists, we have to go and explore those underwater landscapes. Eventually, we know that the water level rose, right? And we have the shorelines that we know today. And how did that happen? What was the water fluctuation really like? Sometimes it was really variable. So occasionally, this actually resulted in really quick, catastrophic, almost blink of an eye events. There's one in particular that's called the Storegga tsunami. So over here, looking at this map, you can see a light green area called Doggerland. That's sort of like a Bering Land Bridge, but over in the UK. That is also a now submerged continent. Doggerland was also a whole big area where prehistoric peoples and plants and animals were living. It's often called Britain's Atlantis, but don't go too far down that rabbit hole. It's Atlantis in the sense that it would have been dry land. And there's evidence geologically that there would have been a tsunami. So water levels rose so fast and covered part of Doggerland that it happened really, really quickly. And this image is an artist reconstruction of a tidal wave that's actually coming and flooding a Mesolithic village. This would have been around 6,000 years ago. So people in the past were often dealing with these rising water levels and what it meant for the environment and where they were living. Another one of these big continents, Australia, also used to be much larger. So you have those lower water levels that resulted in Australia being attached to the Aru Islands and Tasmania. That was one much bigger continent called Sahul. So they all have names. They're all these ancient places that used to be populated by people. And it wasn't always a tsunami, right? It wasn't always these big tidal waves. Sometimes water levels just rose gradually, but over the course of a generation, people would be able to see that these landscapes were flooding. So there would have been some seasonal impacts. So these are another artist reconstruction of Mesolithic peoples returning to a summer camp after being gone and coming back in the summer to their maybe summer cabin and being like, ooh, it's not there anymore with these water levels rising. So you have these variable water level events. Some were really fast, some were slow and gradual, but all of them would have really impacted prehistoric people, right? And where they were living. Where are they going to go? Are they going to be able to hunt in those same areas? Or are those landscapes, are those territories going to be submerged? This is an article where some archaeologists and many other scientists worked together to map the superhighways the first Australians would have used to enter that continent. And this is basically just the routes that they think people would have took when they were peopling Australia for the first time. So all of this is the really important background to telling that story of being back further in time where you had all these landscapes available and people were living there. Anywhere people live, we know this, we leave a lot of stuff behind. It's true now, it was true in the past, and that's exactly what archaeologists study, right? The materials that are left behind from ancient peoples. So this kind of archaeology is becoming a really important part of the field. There's honestly only a handful of us that are doing this kind of work, that are working underwater and not looking at shipwrecks, that are doing this much older archaeology, submerged. And the important part is it's not just more of the same. We're not finding the same archaeological sites we find on land. We're finding really unique data. So just like that shipwreck is really well preserved because it's underwater, these ancient sites are also really well preserved because they're underwater. So there's plant remains, there's rooted trees, there's all this data we wouldn't normally have, and you're gonna see some of that in the Great Lakes. That makes it really honestly worth the challenge of diving into these waters and going underwater because the data is so much better than we can often get on land. So just to give you this last sense of what these environments would have looked like before we dive into our Great Lakes case study, there's a lot of modeling that takes place. So people who are paleoclimatologists, paleoenvironmentalists, working with us as archaeologists to try to understand what were these lost worlds like. And the good news and the interesting news for us as scientists is it wasn't just any landscape. These are some of the best landscapes. So if you think about where people might live now, people really love living on the coast, right? It's like location, location, location. It's true of real estate today, and it was true of real estate 9,000, 10,000 years ago. The coastlines are beautiful, and they're really productive habitats. You can fish in the water, you can hunt inland, there's all sorts of plants that grow there, right? You can have a really great range of food for your diet. So that's what we know these ancient landscapes would have looked like. This is another artist reconstruction. You can tell I like these to get this visual sense of what the past really looked like. This is the Paleolithic Plain. It's off the coast of South Africa. Again, would have been dry land, and this really diverse and really productive habitat where people would have been living. I'm trying to get some colleagues to start a project here with me. If any of you are Discovery Channel fans, this is where the great white sharks have their breeding grounds. So no one's really excited about doing underwater archaeology in this particular area, but the data's out there, right? Somebody has to go and do it. So I'm working on it. We're working up to it. There's no sharks in the Great Lakes, right? So we gotta take baby steps. So inland lakes also experienced these same kind of water level events. Big inland lakes like Lake Titicaca in South America had extreme fluctuations in water levels. It wasn't always Lake Titicaca now. It had low stands, times of lower water. It had high stands, times of higher water. And even today, seasonally, this is an article that shows that Lake Titicaca nears a record low as El Nino bites. So this woman is actually standing on what normally is underwater in Lake Titicaca. So inland lakes also experience these same kind of changes in fluctuations in water levels and changes in the environment. And there's archaeology there, and there's archaeology in our Great Lakes too. So the North American Great Lakes are interesting because they're complicated, and scientists like hard things to study sometimes. So after the end of the last ice age, so ice age is over, it's the post-glacial history. So what was going on in this region, this part of the world? You have the early Holocene climate, so it's starting to get a little bit warmer. You have glacial meltwater, so the environment's warmer, but you have this really cold water that's still flooding the area. You have the Great Lakes being carved out. Isostatic rebound is when the tectonic plates shift and come up from the weight of the ice, finally melting off them. The land actually bounces back up. That's called isostatic rebound. Then you have new hydrological outlets, which just simply means that rivers were being formed and carved out as the glaciers were retreating. And then all of this results in these really fluctuating water levels, right? So you have, it's warmer, but there's glacial meltwaters, there's new rivers, there's isostatic rebound, so the land's shifting, and that just means the water levels in the Great Lakes were kind of going up and down in these really unique ways. So this is where we are. This is the Great Lakes we all know and love, and we're gonna focus the rest of the talk on Paleo Lake Stanley. So this is what ancient Lake Huron is called, zeroing in on the Lake Huron Basin. All 5 of the Great Lakes experienced these fluctuations in water levels, and you can see that. So these are them today. This is them around 10,000 years ago. So they're much, much lower. All of them are just smaller. It's like all the lakes kind of shrunk. And that lower water means there's more land, right? More land available for people and plants and animals to live on. So old Lake Huron now was actually 3 lakes, 3 separate lakes during this time period called Lake Stanley between 11,000 and about 8,000 years ago. These are a couple more maps just to familiarize this area, this part of the world, and looking at Lake Huron. And this is a bathymetric chart, which is basically just topography, but below water. So on this particular map, anything that is that red, orange, or yellow color, all of that would have been dry land, the end of Lake Stanley, or during Lake Stanley, the Lake Stanley time period. And you can see another characterization of it on the other side, and there's this really interesting rocky ridge. It's called the Alpina Amberley Ridge. Scientists, I hate to tell this to a group of artists, we're not the most creative people. So this runs from Alpena to Amberley, and that's why it's called the Alpina Amberley Ridge. It's Alpena in Michigan to Amberley in Ontario, but it would have served as this dry land corridor. that split contemporary Lake Huron into two when it was lower and offered this kind of dry land bridge, right? This, to me, looks much more like a land bridge than Beringia, right? Beringia is a whole big continent. This is actually a pretty narrow feature. So has anyone ever seen Drain the Oceans? That show on, right, Discovery and History. They did one episode on Drain the Great Lakes, and they featured this project. So this image is courtesy of National Geographic. And we always say this is sort of a Canadian eye view of the world. So you're looking south and Michigan, right? So you have the Michigan thumb. This is Alpena and Thunder Bay up here. Everything that's green is our modern land surface. Everything that's tan is what would have been dry land during Lake Stanley. So in this picture, you almost have twice the available landscape, right? That would have been dry. And all of this has to do with those lower water levels. So they were 100 meters lower, so about 300 feet lower. That means anywhere in Lake Huron that's less than 300 feet would have been dry land. That's crazy to think about how much water, right? The volume of water that was gone from the Great Lakes. This area is about 250,000 hectares. It's just a large, vast landscape that was available. The Alpena Amberley Ridge itself is that kind of rocky ridge that cuts across this image. It's about 145 kilometers long. It's pretty narrow, between 12 and 16 kilometers wide. And now this ridge, this landform, so the Alpena Amberley Ridge and the archaeological sites are between 25 and 30 meters deep. So they're about 100 feet deep on average. So they're not shallow by any means. They're 100 feet underwater. And there's a cultural occupation and archaeological record that dates to just around 9,000 years ago. I'm not going to talk a ton about methods, about how we do archaeology underwater, but I am happy to answer any questions folks have about it. This is just to kind of show you, like, how do you do this? How do you find sites that are this ancient in the middle of the lake, especially when you don't have an image of a shipwreck in mind, right? We don't know what these sites are going to look like necessarily. There aren't written records that are 9,000 years old. So you have to start at a really big scale and work your way down to find these archaeological sites. It starts with really large scale, what I call macro scale mapping using sonar. So a couple different kinds of sonar, side scan sonar and multi-beam sonar are the two techniques that we've used to map the bottom of Lake Huron. And you'd think we'd have really good maps in the Great Lakes, and we don't. We actually really don't know very much about the bottom, the lake bed of many of the lakes. So as archaeologists, we went and mapped some of these areas ourselves to get a sense of what the dry landscape would have looked like, right? Were there mountains? Were there rivers? Were there hills? You know, what did that environment look like that people were living in? Once you have those big maps, you start zeroing into that kind of middle scale, a mesoscale. You use different kinds of sonars. This is an image of a scanning sonar. I'll talk more about that archaeological site. This is an autonomous underwater vehicle. If it looks like a torpedo, it kind of feels like a torpedo when you put it in the water, to be honest. You program this, you tell it where to go. It dives below the surface. It drives what we call a survey pattern, and then it pops back up and has all the data for you. You want your boat to be close to it, but not too close, because it really will arrive exactly where it says it's going to come up. So we use different kinds of techniques to map the lake bed. And then once we're really sure we have an archaeological site, we go in with underwater robots. This one's name is Jake. This is my robot sidekick. And we have scuba divers, right? So people go and we get boots on the ground, as we like to say, and start mapping and excavating and doing archaeology just like we would do on land. We just happen to be in 100 feet of water. So this is a quick video just to show you what the Alpena Amberley Ridge looks like now. So some of you, I think, might be scuba divers in the audience. The water now in the Great Lakes is extremely clear, thanks to the zebra and quagga mussels, right? So it's a good news, bad news situation. There's these invasive species that are kind of making this texture, but they've cleaned the water column so much that we use all natural light. So all of the images and pictures you'll see of the bottom of Lake Huron, this is 100 feet of water, and it's all natural lighting because there's so much light that's penetrating down to this landform in the Great Lakes. So Derek is one of the scuba divers, and he's actually, the person filming this is Tyler Schultz, who's here today. There are scuba divers that work on the project, and they were kind of saying, look down, and this is a piece of wood that's just on the bottom, on the lake bed. There's another one that's actually coming into focus now. These are 9,000 years old. So just resting on the bottom of Lake Huron, kind of waiting and waiting, right, for archaeologists to come and find are these ancient remnants of these past environments. They're there, they're sitting on the surface, and we can take samples of them, radiocarbon date them so we know how old they are, see what kind of species of tree they are, and start putting together what the paleo environment or the ancient environment would have looked like when it was dry. We use many different kinds of techniques. The colorful one is multi-beam sonar. And this is actually looking at an interesting feature we just found 2 summers ago. This is a peat bog. So has anyone ever heard or seen the bog bodies in Europe, right? Okay, several people. So bog bodies in Europe are human remains. They're individuals, and they're very famous because they're preserved so well. They're preserved so well because they're encased in peat, kind of like moss, like a swampy peat bog. There's no oxygen, so they don't degrade, they don't erode, and there's a peat bog underneath Lake Huron. So in 100 feet of water, right, dating to this ancient landscape, you have a peat bog. This is Tyler again taking a sample of the peat bog that's preserved on the Alpena Amberley Ridge. This was a really exciting day because on the sonar, it just looked like a rock line. And I was watching Tyler through the robot, and he just picked up something underwater when he was scuba diving. And I was like, what am I seeing? And because it's peat, it's not rocks. It's this really light kind of organic material. So we got this up on the boat. These are some images of taking a sample underwater and then one on the boat. These small little orange circles you see in that, those are seeds. They're 9,000-year-old seeds that are just rolling out of this peat bog. So the preservation is just spectacular, right? I'm an archaeologist. I've worked all over the world. I'd never seen anything like this, right? It's so worthwhile although challenging, to work underwater. So we know now more about the ancient environment because it's just down there. It's preserved. So you have macrobotanical remains, so big, right, visible pieces of plant material. There's pollen that archaeologists have identified from white spruce, birch, tamarack, alder, and willow. So there's a range of plant species that are preserved. And we are currently working with scientists at Cambridge who are tracing ancient DNA that's preserved in this peat bog. So I should have those results in about a month. I know that there's ancient DNA in it. They can see what kind of animals and plants were living in that landscape through the DNA that's preserved. So we're working on that. So altogether, this environment looks like it was a subarctic-like landscape. The glacier was still there. So it was up in Canada, but it was close enough that it would have been pretty cold still. And we know that from kind of willow, right, and spruce, some of those plants that were there. There's sphagnum moss that's also been recovered in the pollen. So a subarctic-like landscape, but what is the archaeology like? What were the people doing that were living in this environment? What became really interesting is there are these rock features that are architectural features for hunting that are preserved below the lake. So this black and white image is showing a site that's in Victoria Island. So this is in British Columbia on land, totally dry. It's an archaeological site showing a caribou hunting trap, effectively. So there's 2 stone lines that were created by people to make sort of a funnel shape. And caribou are tricky. They follow straight lines. I'll talk about this more in just the next slide. But this is the way that people used to hunt animals. It's called a drive lane. You used to drive them kind of into where you wanted them to go. The image below that is a sonar image from Lake Huron showing, to the same scale, a drive lane that's in Lake Huron. And then this is a hunting blind. So just like people use hunting blinds for deer today, right? We are usually made out of wood or cloth. Back in the day in the Great Lakes, they were made out of stone because that was the material that was available. And hunting blinds were found that date to 9,000 years ago that are on this feature. So I could talk about hunting to no end, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to reference a book. Shameless self-promotion. This is a book I did a couple years ago called The Architecture of Hunting. So we found these sites below water in Lake Huron. This is one called the funnel site, so you can see the same kind of funnel feature that is in Lake Huron. This one's in about 80 feet of water. But the thing that's really interesting about this is it's found all over the world. So they're not just in Lake Huron. There's actually sites that are made out of stone for hunting animals all over. We refer to this as niche construction. It's just that people are kind of modifying the natural environment around them to make their lives easier, right? You make a trap for animals so you don't have to roam around and hunt them across the landscape. This has so much to do with animal behavior, and it's because caribou and many animals like that have hoofed animals, they're called ungulates, they follow straight lines. So the best example of this is in Alaska when they were building the oil pipelines. They built them really tall, so the caribou and reindeer could migrate under them. But the caribou, after the pipelines were built, migrated up to them and saw the pipeline. They could have walked under it, but they took a right turn and they followed the pipeline. So thousands of animals were walking through downtowns where they had never been before because they were following this pipeline. And the engineers were like, what's going on? You know, we built them tall enough so they could pass under it. And indigenous peoples there were like, yeah, they follow straight lines. Like our ancestors knew that. So now for those pipelines, they had to cover them over with dirt. They zigzag all over the place. They had to do all these things to break up the linearity because the caribou will just follow them. So that's like a modern problem that people weren't aware of. And people 9,000 years ago in the Great Lakes knew that about animal behavior. So they built these stone lines to trap them, right? To just kind of corral them into exactly where you want them to go. So they had to know the local environment really well. They had to know animal behavior really well. And that together is called traditional ecological knowledge, right? It's the knowledge that people have about their environment and their place. So we can use those sites to learn more about the people and how they interacted with their environment. This is just another image. This is what's called photogrammetry. So it's a 3D rotatable model of one of the archaeological sites called Funnel. So this is just kind of showing you the overall shape of one of those hunting features. I used to be able to say these are the oldest in the planet, but I can't anymore because we found more, which is good. I actually like this as a scientist. I like being able to change my slides and update with new information. So the Lake Huron structures are around 9,000 years old. Colleagues of mine in the Baltic last year found a big structure like this that they think was for hunting red deer. So there's one in the Baltic. There's one on land in Jordan, these same kind of hunting structures. They're all right around 9,000 years old. And there's not just one site below Lake Huron. There's actually 60 of these that our team has been researching in 3 different areas across that Alpena-Amberley Ridge. They range in size and complexity, so some of them are really large, about 30 meters or about 100 feet long, those drive lanes. Others are smaller, and they're just individual hunting blinds, like, again, you would have a deer blind today. So some of them are small, some of them are big. You can also connect them to the season that they were used in. And a terrestrial archaeologist taught me this. So if you're hunting and you have a V blind, so a V shape, it only works if you're hiding in the apex of the V, right? It only works if you're hiding behind it. So it only works if animals are coming from a certain direction. So depending on the orientation of the structure, we can tell if the animals would have been migrating in the fall or in the spring. So you can get at seasonality. And all, like 9,000 years ago, I can tell you that people were hunting in the fall and the spring in what is now Lake Huron, right? You can get at this level of detail because of these archaeological sites, because they're so well preserved. So the complex structures, some of the bigger ones, would have required a lot of people cooperating, right? So I don't think this is just a couple people. Some of these bigger structures would have had men, women, and children, right? Whole family groups and their friends out kind of maybe channeling the animals, maybe suggesting that they follow these drive lanes, right? And then into a corral feature. So this is a drawing that was done by a Nunamiut individual. His name is Simon Peniak. He worked with archaeologists in the 1960s, but he remembered his family doing caribou hunts like this. So this is his drawing of one of those hunting episodes, and then compared to one of the ones that's below Lake Huron. This art. Perfect. So there's a really amazing engraved antler, ivory antler, right? That's at FIA in just one of the galleries just down here. But this is one I was working in a museum, and this was just laying out on a table, and it literally stopped me in my tracks because it's the same thing. So this is an art piece, right? It's an engraved walrus tusk, but it's showing this same sort of feature, this drive lane. I refer to this as the idiot's guide to hunting because it's just showing you how to do it. It's like, build a thing like this and the animals will come. So the thing that's so wonderful about these, once I started diving into it, is They're underwater, they're on land, but they're in art, right? They're in rock art in many places around the world. So there's these oral histories about them too. So this is a way of interacting with animals that people have been doing for a long time, and it was important enough, right, that they put it in their artwork. So within the structures, within those hunting features, there's also artifacts. These are two of the most important. I always say that little small pieces have a big story to tell, because these are small. That scale is 2 millimeters, so these artifacts are about this big. And these are the remnants from making a stone tool. So if you think about sharpening a knife, right, you might have like some microscopic little metal shave off when you're sharpening your knife. People in the past used stone, so you're chipping the stone to sharpen the edge and some chips come off, and that's what these are. But they're not just any chips, they're made out of obsidian, which is a volcanic glass. So there aren't any volcanoes close to us, right, in the Great Lakes. So where did the stone come from? So working with 2 different techniques in 3 different labs, these artifacts, the raw material, so the stone they were made on, was traced to Oregon. So wagon tire, the wagon tire obsidian source, that's 4,000 kilometers away. So what that means is that people 9,000 years ago, before social media, before domesticated horses, right, before cars, before trains, people were moving around the landscape and had social connections across the continent, and they were trading goods back and forth, maybe caribou, right? And trading things that they had in their environment for things that people had elsewhere. Obsidian is a really valuable material because it's like glass, so it's so sharp, right? So people in the past used it a lot because it made a really effective cutting weapon, and archaeologists like it because we can trace it to exactly where it came from. So this is one of those results. It's like a good day when you're a scientist and everyone's like, what? When you get confused because no one thought that it came from that far away, but the labs confirmed that that's where these 2 obsidian traces came from. There's other kinds of stone tools. The thing that's really unique about these is they don't look like what we thought they would look like. Another good time to be surprised as a scientist. So we're still trying to understand exactly what the stone tool technology was like out on the Alpena Amberley Ridge. They're smaller. Some of them are ground stone, so just different kinds of technologies. There's a PhD student at the University of Michigan that's working on this right now. And the last part of this project that has been really fun and interesting is doing virtual archaeology. So I think it's really important to share archaeology with the public, right? So when I dig on land, I have people come and they do tours of the sites. But we can't take people 50 miles offshore, right, and scrap scuba tanks to their backs and be like, it's down there, right? So you can't do what we call public archaeology the way that you'd really want to. And doing underwater archaeology in the middle of Lake Huron is really hard. It's difficult to find those sites. So we started working with computer programmers to use artificial intelligence combined with traditional ecological knowledge, and we created a virtual world of the Alpena Amberley Ridge, of Lake Huron when it was dry land. So these are 2 members of the Western Arctic Caribou Herd Working Group. The National Science Foundation sent myself and members of our team up to Alaska to talk to caribou hunters. Because we were like, we're finding all this evidence of caribou hunting, but we don't know anything about caribou hunting. Let's go talk to experts. So rather than taking them all right out into the lake and then trying to get them underwater, we took the virtual world up to Alaska, up to the Arctic, and had caribou hunters enter it using virtual reality. And then they talked to us about what they were seeing and about those sites. This paid for itself within the first 2 minutes. Cyrus Harris is the one in the plaid. And he put the headset on and immediately was like, why are all the caribous girls? And we were like, oh. So computer programmers from Wayne State University who live in Detroit, who had never seen a caribou in their life, just made all the caribou the same, right? So they had one caribou model and they just replicated it thousands of times. And Cyrus, who's seen caribou and hunts them, was like, they're all females. So now, good news, the caribou herd is now, there's juveniles, there's calves, right? There's males and there's females. But it was brilliant, right? Because it's like as an archaeologist, we never thought about that. And this guy just has all this knowledge from being a hunter, right? He knows these animals better than we do. So their feedback is in that virtual world. So these are actually older, we're making brand new ones, but this is, imagine if you had the headset on and you were walking through the Alpena Amberley Ridge the way it used to look 9,000 years ago when it was dry land. The computer programmers love the Northern Lights, so that's in there. If you spend 24 minutes in the game, it approximates a whole day, right? So each minute equals an hour. So 24 minutes you experience, right? You can see the sunrise, you can see the sunset. It's like having a whole day in this ancient world. This is if you're standing on the rocky shoreline, looking out into Lake Stanley. I'm an underwater archaeologist, so of course I was like, we got to be able to go underwater. So you can go underwater off of the Alpena Amberley Ridge and see what ancient Paleo Lake Stanley would have looked like. And the really fun thing about this too is that we created this for us, right? To try to find sites a little bit better and to learn more about that environment through hunters. But it became a really great teaching tool as well. So we can take this game, a version of this game, it's the keyboard version. Not everybody likes the virtual reality goggles, so you can do it just, looking at the computer screen. And we have students who learn about Native American history and culture, they learn about animal biology, they learn about underwater archaeology, about computer programming, and then they explore this world. And based on that knowledge they've gained, they pick spots where they think archaeological sites might be found, and then we take them out on the boat and see what's there. So high school students, this is Alpena High School up in Alpena, Michigan, and we've worked with students all over. So the ultimate goal is to have this be kind of like a virtual pen pal situation where students from Alaska and students from the Great Lakes can be in there at the same time and be in the virtual world and talk to each other and have teams and that sort of thing. So the virtual world connections are really fun. I'm a professor, so of course I always think education is really important. I used to live in Texas, and I brought students from Texas to the Great Lakes, and they were very cold, but they had a wonderful time. They, to this day, do not believe me that Lake Huron is a lake. They're like, it's an ocean. We don't care what you say. It's very funny. They mapped some shipwrecks. So training the next generation of people who do this is really important because we're only going to have more and more archaeological sites underwater. So as a professor, this is a big part of sort of my day-to-day life is training students from the K through 12 and then all the way up into graduate school level to do this kind of work. New research. So just quickly, I just got hired at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee about a year and a half ago, and they hired me because I used this in my job talk, in my presentation, and I was like, look, you are right on this lake. So just like Lake Stanley, Lake Chippewa is in the Lake Michigan basin, same thing. So Lake Michigan was much lower, so there was a lot of available land. So I have some grant funding to start a new project there to look for archaeological sites. So I'm staying in the Great Lakes, I'm not going anywhere. And just a couple things, if you want to learn more about this is a new show on the History Channel. I did not get to meet Danny Trejo, unfortunately, but it's called Mysteries Unearthed, and the very first episode, you can watch it online for free. It talks about the Lake Huron project. I had a book that just came out, the Anthropological Archaeology Underwater, and then soon, next month, they're great courses. If anybody's seen these are available online. They're streaming. I'm doing a 12-episode series on underwater archaeology. So there's cold water, there's Great Lakes, but there's shipwrecks, there's warships, there's pirates, there's mutiny, there's all sorts of exciting things in it. So that's coming, and then very last couple things. May 15th, if you know anyone who will be in Traverse City, a team of us is going to be up there. We're working with Points North and NPR, and we're going to have the virtual world there. So people can use the virtual world and enter it in virtual reality if they like to see what those ancient Great Lakes would have looked like. The International Association of Great Lakes Research is happening in Milwaukee, so that's a conference. But I wanted to ping this too. So this is opening at the Intrepid Museum in New York. Mysteries from the Deep, Exploring Underwater Archaeology. The Lake Huron project is going to be featured in this museum exhibit. It's going to be traveling, they hope, for 5 to 7 years all over the world. So it's going to open in New York this summer. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully it'll come somewhere close by. And all of this is just showing us and showing me as a scientist and all of us that there's different ways to understand our past, right, and explore it. So you can do good old-fashioned archaeology. This is what we normally look like. We're sort of normally in the middle of nowhere, just taking notes, looking at funny rock features on the landscape. So you can do this on land, but you can also do it underwater, just the same way. And now we can do it in virtual reality too. So how we're exploring the past is changing really rapidly, and the Great Lakes are a really important part of that story. So with that, I want to just thank you all again so much. And we have some time for questions if anyone has any.